In his final moments, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, whispered something to his daughter. Words that first made her weep with bitter grief, and then, a breath later, made her face light up with joy. What secret could move a loving daughter to smile at the moment of her father's death? Fatima's life was a path through hunger, loss, and political turmoil, one that ended in the most mysterious death in the history of Medina. 2 billion people know her name, yet 14 centuries later, no one on earth knows where she is buried. Chapter 1. The daughter he carried in his arms. There is a question that is rarely asked, and even more rarely answered with honesty. Why did the most powerful man of his age, a prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, before whom kings and tribal chieftains bowed, whom thousands of warriors obeyed, who altered the course of history with a single word, why did this man rise to his feet every single time his daughter entered the room? Not out of respect for her position, not out of political necessity, not because custom demanded it. He rose because he loved her the way you only love someone when you understand that the person beside you is something greater than merely close. Her name was Fatima, and the story you are about to hear is one of those stories that changes the way you see not only the early Middle Ages, not only Islam, but the very nature of what it means to be human in a world that does not understand you. Medina, the 6th century of the Common Era, a city that had by this time already lived through years of unbroken upheaval, wars, forced migrations, betrayals by allies, years of famine, epidemics. In this city, in a house of sun-dried brick with an earthen floor and a roof of palm fronds, a girl grew up about whom her father would one day speak words that became among the most famous in the history of Islam. Fatima is a part of me. Whoever harms her, harms me. A simple phrase, but behind it stands something that most people miss, distracted as they are by the political disputes swirling around her name. Behind it stands a life. Fatima was born, according to the most widely accepted account, approximately 5 years before the beginning of her father's prophetic mission. This means she spent her childhood not in the home of a prosperous merchant, but in the home of a man whom his own tribe had declared a madman, a poet, a sorcerer, a man against whom an economic blockade had been organized so brutal that for several years running the family was forced to eat the leaves of trees to avoid starvation. She remembered this. She was there. She was the little girl who watched her father come home after the crowds had mocked him, thrown stones at him, poured the entrails of animals over him at the walls of the mosque. And it was she, not a grown man, not a battle-hardened warrior, not a wise counselor, who would approach him, wash him clean, and hold him. She was called Abiha, the mother of her own father. Not because she was older than him, but because in his moments of deepest vulnerability, she gave him what only a mother gives: unconditional acceptance. This small detail is not a poetic metaphor. It is the key to everything that follows. Because Fatima's story is about how a person raised in fire does not become ash, about how pain does not harden, it purifies, about how a woman from whom almost everything will be taken, first her mother, then her sisters, then her father, then, according to some accounts, a child, remains herself until her very last breath. And here is what is truly astonishing. She lived on this earth approximately 28 or 29 years. Historians disagree on the exact dates, but no one disputes the other fact. She outlived her father by only a matter of months. The Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, died in the 11th year of the Hijrah, and before his death, by all accounts, he leaned close and whispered something to her, something that first made her weep and then made her smile. What did he say? The answer will come. But already now, at the very beginning of this story, it is worth pausing to feel what you feel when you suddenly understand. Before you is not an icon, not a political symbol, not a name on a battle standard. Before you is a person, and the story of that person is only beginning. Chapter 2. The Girl the Fire Raised. To understand Fatima, you must first understand the world into which she came. Mecca at the end of the 6th century was not the romantic image found in illustrated books. It was a dusty trading city at the crossroads of caravan routes, where power was measured in the number of camels you owned and the strength of your kinship ties. Where the birth of a girl was met in some households with silence, or worse, where the practice of burying newborn daughters alive was not legend, but documented reality, the practice the Quran would later address directly and fiercely. Into this world came Fatima, but she came into a particular household, the home of a man who, even before the prophetic mission began, was known among the Meccans by two words: al-Amin, the trustworthy, the faithful. His name was Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, and by the time Fatima was born, he was already married to Khadija, a widow, a wealthy merchant, a woman of such formidable character that she had proposed to him herself, breaking every convention of her time. Khadija was Fatima's first mother, and here something important is hidden. Because Khadija was not simply a wealthy woman who gave her husband a home and a fortune. She was the first person on earth to believe in his prophecy. Before all the men, before all the chieftains, before all the sages. When he came home shaking after the first revelation in the cave of Hira, trembling, terrified, speaking of a being made of light that had pressed him so hard he thought his bones might break, it was Khadija who held him and spoke the words that any person would want to hear in the moment of their greatest fear. By God, he will never humiliate you. Fatima grew up in that house. She witnessed that love. She absorbed it every day the way she absorbed the smell of dust at the threshold and the sound of camel bells drifting from the market street beyond the wall. But then the trials began. When the prophecy became public, the world around the family shifted sharply, the way the air shifts before a storm. Yesterday's neighbors became strangers. Yesterday's trading partners became enemies. The tribal chieftain Abu Lahab, the prophet's own uncle, declared open war on him. His wife scattered thorn branches on the path in front of the house. And Fatima, the little girl who was not yet 10 years old, saw all of it. She saw her father seized at the mosque one day, his own garment wound around his neck as if to strangle him. She saw stones thrown at him as he walked the street. She knew about the 3 terrible years of the siege in the valley of Shib Abi Talib, when the entire clan of Banu Hashim was driven into a mountain ravine, cut off from trade, from water, from any reasonable supply of food. When the cries of hungry children could be heard from the ravine by the Meccans out on their streets at night, and some of them turned away, pretending not to hear. Fatima was among those children. She survived that ravine, and it was there, in those conditions, that her character was formed. Not broken, but tempered. Islamic sources are unanimous in describing her as a person of exceptional inner strength, capable of bearing suffering without the loss of dignity. This was not a trait she was born with. It was an education, the most unsparing education possible. And then, over the span of several years, death began to harvest her family. First died 2 brothers, both in infancy, then her mother. Khadija died in the year that the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, would later call the year of sorrow. That same year took Abu Talib as well, the uncle who had shielded him from the tribe when no one else dared. 2 losses in succession, 2 shields that vanished at once. Fatima was about 15 years old, and again, she was there. She cared for her dying mother. She saw her father's face after Khadija's death, the face of a man who had lost not merely a wife, but a witness. The only person who had known him from the very beginning, who remembered every step of the journey. There is one detail, mentioned in several sources, that for all its smallness speaks more eloquently about the nature of their bond than any official biography. After Khadija's death, the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, kept her belongings for a long time. When friends of Khadija's came to visit, he received them with particular warmth because they reminded him of her. And when one of those close to him once permitted himself to show surprise at this lingering attachment, it was Fatima who rose to defend her mother's memory. She said not a single word of reproach. She simply made it clear, by everything she was, this subject is closed. She was about 15 years old. She had just lost her mother, and she was protecting not herself. She was protecting her father's grief. Abiha, the mother of her own father. Suddenly the nickname ceases to seem like a beautiful metaphor and becomes instead a precise description of reality. But life did not stand still in sorrow, because ahead lay the migration to Medina. Ahead lay the years when a small Meccan family would become the heart of a new state. And Fatima's name would be written into history not only as the daughter of the Prophet, but as the name of a woman who, in one of the most politically charged moments of early Islamic history, stood before the people and delivered a speech that left its witnesses, by all accounts, breathless. But that moment was still several years away, and in those years something else happened. Something that is usually mentioned in passing as a simple biographical fact. Fatima was married, and the story of that marriage is nothing like the way it is usually told. Chapter 3. A marriage that sought no equal. Some love stories look beautiful only from a distance, and then there are stories that grow more beautiful the closer you come. Stories that reveal a new layer with every new look, not of romantic sentiment, but of something rarer and more real. Something you might call choice, if that word were not too simple for what is meant here. The story of Fatima's marriage is exactly that kind of story. Medina, the second year of the Hijrah. The city had already welcomed the emigrants, already survived its first military confrontations, already begun to take on the shape of what it was destined to become. The Prophet's mosque, peace and blessings be upon him, was still under construction or had only just been completed. A plain building of palm trunks and sun-dried brick, without ornament, without domes, without the architectural grandeur that would come later. Simply a place where people gathered. It was at this time that men began coming to the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, to ask for his daughter's hand. Not one man, several. Among them were men of wealth and standing, men with weight in the community, men who by any external measure of the time might have been considered excellent matches. The Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, refused them all. Calmly, without explanations that would humiliate the petitioner, but firmly. And none of the sources tell us that Fatima was displeased by these refusals, because she, it seems, was waiting for the man she had known since childhood. Ali ibn Abi Talib was the Prophet's cousin, and one of the first to accept Islam. According to some accounts, he had done so as a child, before he was even 10 years old. He had grown up in the Prophet's household as an adopted son. In the years when the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, had taken him in to ease the burden of his father, Abu Talib, in difficult times. This meant that Fatima and Ali had grown up under the same roof. They had survived the siege in the ravine together. They had lost Khadija together. They had survived the emigration from Mecca together, that terrifying night flight when everything you had been rooted to since birth had to be left behind, and you walked into the darkness not knowing if you would arrive alive. When Ali finally came to the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, to ask for Fatima's hand, he came nearly empty-handed. He had no wealth, no house, none of the material assets that by the customs of the time made a groom desirable. All he had was a coat of mail, the single item of value he owned. And the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, asked Fatima. This is a detail worth pausing over and feeling fully. The 7th century of the Arabian Peninsula, a world in which daughters were given in marriage as part of political and commercial agreements, in which a woman's opinion on the matter was, to put it mildly, not the primary criterion. And this father asked his daughter. Fatima was silent, but it was a particular silence, a silence that in the Arab tradition of the time signified consent, and which the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, understood precisely that way. But more important than tradition is this: he asked it all. Her opinion mattered. Between this father and this daughter, there existed a trust so deep that silence could be an answer, because she knew that had she said no, he would have accepted it just as calmly. The wedding was simple to the point that it drew both admiration and reproach, depending on who was telling the story. Fatima's dowry amounted, according to various sources, to approximately 480 dirhams, or a somewhat different sum, as historians differ on the particulars. But all sources agree on one thing: it was very little for the daughter of the man her father had by then become, the leader of a community, a man to whom envoys traveled from distant lands. The feast was modest, the food plain. The house Fatima moved into was small, bare-walled, furnished with the minimum. And here begins the part of the story that is usually either idealized beyond recognition or skipped over entirely. Life in that marriage was physically hard. This is not metaphor or exaggeration. It is documented fact, preserved in several sound hadiths. She ground grain by hand until her palms were calloused. She carried water in leather skins until her shoulders were worn raw. She swept and cleaned with such intensity that her clothes were thick with dust. Historical sources report that the marks of the handmill were visible on her hands. On one occasion, and this episode survives in several versions, all considered reliable, she went to her father to ask for a servant. Simply a household helper, not luxury, not privilege, just someone who could help with the work that was wearing her down physically. The Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, did not give her a servant, but he gave her something else. He taught her words that would later be known in Islamic tradition as the tasbih of Fatima, to say Subhanallah 33 times, Alhamdulillah 33 times, Allahu Akbar 34 times, before sleep, every night, and he told her this was better than a servant. This moment can be read in different ways. You can see in it severity. You can see spiritual pedagogy. You can see a father who knew his daughter deeply enough to understand that what she needed was not relief from labor, but the strengthening of the inner resource that would sustain her through the trials still to come. Fatima accepted this. She did not leave wounded. She accepted these words and spoke them every night until the last night of her life. And life continued. Children were born: Hassan, Hussein, Zainab, Kulthum, each of them a story in their own right, each of them a figure around whom events would unfold that would shape Islamic history for centuries. But for now they were simply children in a small house with bare walls. And Fatima was their mother, a woman whose hands ached from the millstone, who knew the words of the morning remembrance by heart, and who, according to everyone who ever saw her, possessed such deep inner stillness that people in her presence instinctively lowered their voices. She was called al-Zahra, the radiant, the luminous, not for her beauty, for something else, for that quality so difficult to name but impossible to mistake when you encounter it in certain people, the sense that their source of light is within them, not without. But ahead lay the death of her father, and what came after would divide Fatima's story into a before and an after, as sharply as a bolt of lightning splits the sky. Chapter 4. The 11th Year. The End That Became a Beginning. There are moments that change everything, not gradually, not through a chain of causes and effects that historians untangle over years, but immediately, instantly, as if someone has pulled an invisible lever, and the world that existed a second ago will never return. For Fatima, that moment was the month of Safar, or Rabi al-Awwal, in the 11th year of the Hijrah. The Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, fell ill. Not suddenly. The illness came on gradually, granting those who loved him time, while simultaneously stripping them of hope. Several weeks of fever, a growing weakness, days when he could not come out to the people himself, and asked Abu Bakr to lead the prayer in his place. Medina in those days was filled with a particular silence, the kind of silence that comes not from the absence of sound, but from the presence of something unbearably immense. People gathered at the mosque and said nothing. Trade fell still. Even the children, according to accounts, played more quietly than usual. Fatima was at her father's side almost without pause. She watched his strength drain away, day by day, the way water seeps from a cracked vessel. She saw his face in his hours of relief, and in his hours when the fever surged so high that he lost the thread of conversation. Sources tell us she wiped the sweat from his brow and wept watching him suffer. And he looked at her and told her that Gabriel had reviewed the Quran with him once each year, but this year, twice, and that this most likely heralded the end. She wept. And then he leaned close and whispered something more. What exactly, she did not reveal at once. But after those words, according to Aisha, who witnessed the scene, Fatima suddenly smiled through her tears. Aisha asked her about it later. Fatima replied that she would not betray the secret of the Messenger of God during his lifetime. But after his death, she told it. He had whispered to her that she would be the first of his family to follow him, that she would soon be reunited with him. She had wept when she heard it, and then she smiled, because she understood that the separation would be brief. The Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, died on a Monday, the 12th of Rabi al-Awwal, of the 11th year of the Hijrah. The precise date remains disputed by historians, but these are details. What matters is this: he died with his head resting on Aisha's lap, in the room adjoining the mosque, as the morning sun was already climbing over Medina. The news spread in an instant. The reactions of those who heard it varied. Umar, according to the well-known account, came out with a sword and declared that whoever said the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, had died would lose his head. So unbearable was that reality to him. Abu Bakr entered, kissed the brow of the deceased, and spoke the words that quieted the crowd. Whoever worshipped Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, let him know that Muhammad has died. Whoever worshipped God, God is the ever-living and does not die. And Fatima stood at his body, and she spoke. The sources preserve her words in several versions, but their essence is the same in all of them. She spoke to him. As though he could still hear, she spoke of what he had been, of what the heavens had lost when he departed, of how the earth that received him had become the finest place on earth. Fatima's grief after her father's death was so evident and so profound that it is documented in the sources not as a vague mention of sorrow, but in concrete physical detail. She grew gaunt. She nearly stopped eating. She wept so that the neighbors heard her at night. One hadith, accepted as sound by the majority of scholars, transmits the words of Anas ibn Malik, the Prophet's servant, peace and blessings be upon him, a man who knew the household better than any outsider. He said that after the Prophet's death, Medina seemed to grow dark, and that Fatima changed so visibly it was painful to look at her. But grief was only one half of what was happening to her in those months. The other half was of a different nature entirely, and it was, if possible, even heavier. Because while Fatima was mourning her father, events were unfolding around her that concerned her directly. Political events, events over property and law, words that sound cold, but behind which stood a wholly tangible reality. The matter was the lands of Fadak. Fadak was a garden estate, a prosperous property to the north of Medina, which had come to the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, after the peaceful settlement with its inhabitants, without military conflict. According to Fatima's claim and a number of sources, the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, had during his lifetime given this land to her personally as a gift, a hiba. It was her income, her independence, her means of providing for her family without needing anyone's help. After the Prophet's death, peace and blessings be upon him, The new leadership of the community decided to take Fadak into the state treasury on the basis of a hadith that prophets leave no inheritance, and that whatever remains after them is sadaqah, public property. Fatima did not accept this, and here she did something that does not fit any of the convenient frameworks into which people try to place her. She did not submit in silence. She did not bow her head and receive the decision with resignation. She went to the mosque, the very mosque where her father had prayed, the mosque in which she had grown up, and she delivered a speech, a public speech, before men, before the entire community, in the 7th century in Arabia, a woman. This speech survives in both the Sunni and Shia traditions, though with varying degrees of detail. It is known as the Khutbat Fatima, the Sermon of Fatima, and it is one of the most remarkable documents of early Islamic history, one that most people who consider themselves scholars of this period either do not know at all or prefer not to discuss. Why? Because what she said in that speech fits no comfortable narrative. It was not an outburst, not a complaint, not an appeal for mercy. It was argument, theological, legal, historical. She quoted the Quran, she constructed logic, she spoke of the inheritance of prophets, of the nature of property, of the principles of justice, with such precision and such force that those present, by all accounts, fell silent. The daughter of the man she called her father spoke like a person who knew, not from hearsay, not at second hand, but from the very source, what Islam was and what its principles required. But the decision on Fadak did not change, and Fatima walked out of the mosque, silently, with a straight back, not broken, but changed. Something in her changed that day, and about that we will speak in the next chapter. Chapter 5, The Final Months, a light that fades slowly. There is a particular kind of suffering that does not cry out. It does not beat against walls. It does not demand to be noticed. It is quiet, almost invisible to those who do not know what to look for. But to those who do know, it is visible in every detail. In the way a person holds their head, in the way they answer a greeting, in the way they look at something in the distance, not at any specific point, but through everything visible, towards somewhere that contains neither this room, nor this city, nor this time. This was the state into which Fatima fell after the death of her father and after what had happened in the mosque. Medina went on living. Markets hummed. Camels swayed heavily down dusty streets. The new leadership settled in, sent out envoys, received delegations, conducted the affairs of state. The world did not stop. The world never stops. That is one of its most merciless qualities, and Fatima was leaving it. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the way light leaves a room not when a lamp is extinguished, but when it simply burns itself out, quietly, without the sharp moment of darkness. The physical fading was apparent to everyone who saw her. Aisha, who observed her during these months, later said she had never seen anyone so like the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, in the way he walked, the way he carried himself, the way he entered a room, as Fatima, and that this likeness became almost unbearable to witness as she faded, as though the last living reflection of one who was already gone was departing along with her. But it is important to understand, this was not depression in the modern clinical sense. This was not a person shattered by circumstance, bereft of will. The sources describe Fatima in her final months as a woman fully present, in prayer, in caring for her children, in her relationship with her husband. Only behind all of this stood something that might be called preparation, as though she knew, and the knowledge gave her no peace, yet did not frighten her. She knew she would soon go. Her father had told her, and she was, by all indications, ready. Several episodes from these final months survive in the sources, and for all their outward simplicity, they speak of something essential. One is her conversation with Asma bint Umayyah. Asma was a woman who had traveled widely. She had lived in Ethiopia with her husband Jafar, then returned to Medina, and she possessed a broad horizon, a knowledge of other traditions, another world. Fatima made one request of her, that at her funeral the shape of her body not be so visible beneath the burial shrouds as was customary. She wanted her form to be completely concealed. She wanted her private self to remain private even in death. Asma offered a method she had seen in Ethiopia, a special framework for the bier with a canopy that completely covered the body. Fatima, according to the account, smiled when she heard this and thanked her. This small story is about the quality of her dignity, right to the end. She thought about details. She cared about the image she would leave behind, not out of vanity, out of that particular sense of self that does not dissolve even in the face of death. The other episode is her final conversation with Ali. Sources tell us that in her last days, she asked him not to remarry while their children were still young. She asked to be buried at night. She asked that those with whom she had been in conflict not attend her burial. She did not want hypocrisy at her graveside. These were the requests of someone who had understood everything, accepted everything, and set everything in its place. Ali honored every one of them. But before we speak of Fatima's death, we must pause on what historians and theologians of both main Islamic traditions acknowledge as the most striking aspect of her character in those final months. She was not embittered. Those words, "she was not embittered," sound simple, but behind them stands something that can only be grasped when you fully imagine what she had lived through. The loss of her mother in childhood, the years of the blockade, a life of poverty and marriage despite her father's stature, physical labor until her palms were raw, the loss of her father, the soul closest to her on earth, the dispute over Fadak, which she lost, the speech in the mosque, heard but unheeded. That list might have hardened anyone, but sources from both traditions, Sunni and Shia, for all their differences in political interpretation, agree on this. Fatima in those months was not a woman filled with hatred. She was a woman filled with pain, which is an entirely different thing. Pain is about loss. Hatred is about wanting to destroy. Fatima did not destroy. She spoke the truth, yes. She defended what she believed was just, yes. But there is an enormous distance between that and hatred. This distinction matters, because her name is often raised as a banner in disputes where she herself has no place, as if a living person had been converted into an argument, a symbol, a weapon of polemic. But she was a living person, with calloused hands, with children she loved, with a husband she cared for, with grief she carried inside her, not displaying it beyond what was necessary. And then one day, which different sources describe differently, but the essence is the same in every version, Asma came to her and found her. Fatima had performed a full ritual bath, put on clean clothes, and lay down facing the Qibla. She told Asma that her time had come, and she asked her not to leave her alone. Asma stayed. She sat beside her. And at some point, the sources do not specify, Fatima died. Quietly as a lamp burns before it goes out, without agony, or at least none that was noticed and recorded. Simply, in a certain moment, there was no longer any breath. She was approximately 28 years old, or 29. Historians continue to disagree on the exact date, but no one disputes the other fact. She died approximately 6 months after her father's death, exactly as he had told her. She was the first of his family to follow him. The promise had been kept. But the story of Fatima does not end here, because what happened after her death, the way she was buried, the way she was remembered, the figure she became in the memory of billions of people across 14 centuries, is its own chapter, the last one, and perhaps the most important. Chapter 6. She whom they did not forget. She was buried at night. This is not legend and not metaphor. It is documented historical fact, recognized in both major Islamic traditions. Ali performed the funeral prayer over her in the darkness while the city slept. A small gathering of those who had been close to her. Quiet footsteps through the night streets of Medina. The earth receiving her without witnesses, without a crowd, without official ceremony. She had asked for this herself, and in that request lives her entire character. To the last, she exercised authority over what was still within her power. To the last, she chose silence over spectacle, substance over show, the real over the performed. The location of her grave became a mystery almost immediately after her death, and remains a mystery to this day. This is no exaggeration. Among Islamic scholars, there is no consensus on the precise place where Fatima rests. Three main possibilities are named: the Baqi Cemetery in Medina, her own home, which was subsequently absorbed into the expansion of the Prophet's mosque, and another site within the precincts of the mosque. Each version rests on sources. None is beyond dispute. A person known to the entire Islamic world, and no one knows where she lies. There is something in this that makes you stop, as if she, the one who in life did not want her body to be too visible, who asked for a nighttime burial without too many eyes, received precisely what she had asked for. Her presence in the world is not anchored to any geographical point. It is not locked in any specific patch of earth. It is everywhere her name is spoken, and her name is spoken often, very often. Fatima al-Zahra is among the most venerated figures in Islam, regardless of school or tradition. In the Sunni tradition, she is among the al-Bayt, the household of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, reverence for whom is directly commanded by the Quran. In the Shia tradition, she occupies a place that is difficult to overstate. She is called Siddiqa, the truthful, Tahira, the pure, Muhaddatha, the one to whom angels spoke. Sufi traditions see in her an embodiment of a particular spiritual knowledge, transmitted from father to daughter and through her into the world. But behind all these epithets and titles, behind all this immense posthumous history, stands a living person. And that is precisely what must not be lost. Because the paradox of Fatima is this: the more she is revered, the easier it becomes to lose her. To turn her into an icon, a symbol, an argument in a dispute, a banner for a political movement, an abstract ideal of womanhood or martyrdom. And then the person disappears behind the image. The person with calloused hands, with children in her arms, with grief inside and a smile that Aisha remembered until the end of her own long life. That smile through tears. When her father whispered that she would be first to follow him, she smiled, because she loved him so completely that news of her own imminent death became not a terror, but a consolation. You cannot make a symbol of that. You can only feel it. And here is what is truly astonishing when you look at the full arc of her life, from a childhood spent in a besieged mountain ravine to a nighttime burial in Medina. When you gather all these episodes into a single picture, the blockade, the death of her mother, the poverty of her marriage, the calloused hands, the speech in the mosque, the dispute over Fadak, the slow dissolution after her father's death, you find yourself looking at a life that contained almost no outward triumph. She did not win the dispute over Fadak. She did not change the political decisions of her time. She did not live to see her children grow. She lived fewer than 30 years in a world that left her almost no space in which to simply breathe without pain. And yet, 14 centuries later, her name is spoken daily in hundreds of millions of homes. Mothers give it to their daughters. Theologians quote her sermon. Poets write about her in dozens of languages. People weep remembering her story, not because they are made to weep, but because within that story is something that touches something deep and universal in human beings, regardless of their faith or their era. What is that something? Perhaps this: a story about how greatness does not always look like victory, about how a person can live a life of constrained circumstances, lose nearly everyone they loved, fail to receive what they believed was just, and still not break, not harden, remain themselves until the last breath. This is rare. This is very rare. And it is precisely this, not the titles, not the political interpretations, that has kept her story alive for 1,500 years. The Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, rose to his feet every time she entered the room. He would go to her, take her hand, kiss her on the forehead. Aisha, who had witnessed this many times, once asked him about it. He answered simply, "When I long for the fragrance of paradise, I breathe in her scent." Medina has long since changed beyond recognition. The houses of that era lie buried under centuries of earth or under new construction. The exact location of her grave is unknown. Her voice was recorded on nothing. Her face was preserved in no portrait. What remains is only what she did and who she was, and that has proven sufficient for 14 centuries, which means it will be sufficient for whatever comes after.